May 23, 1944, Anzio, Italy. The dawn was silent until the machine guns spoke. Across the open, shell-pocked fields north of Cisterna, the 135th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 34th Division lay pinned to the earth. The German MG-42s were cutting lanes through the wheat. Each burst like a metallic scream that flattened the stalks and chewed through men alike. The air was thick with cordite, with the heavy, raw scent of blood and churned soil. In the middle of that chaos, one man crawled forward. Staff Sergeant George J. Hall, 21 years old, a squad leader from Massachusetts, dragged himself through the dirt with his elbows, a grenade clutched in each hand. His platoon was trapped. 3 German positions were raking them from a low ridge, and every attempt to move had been met with withering fire. He knew the rules. You didn't throw captured enemy grenades. The fuses were unpredictable, dangerous, but that morning, Hall had no choice. As the smoke drifted low across the Italian plain, he pulled the pin and changed the course of the fight with one forbidden throw. The blast rolled across the field, echoing through the haze. As men shouted and machine guns went silent, Hall's war was only beginning. The battle for Anzio had dragged on for 4 brutal months. What began as an ambitious amphibious landing on January 22, 1944, meant to outflank the German Gustav Line and open the road to Rome, had devolved into a killing ground. Allied troops, British and American, found themselves trapped on a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by German artillery from the Alban Hills. Every movement above ground drew fire. Every ridge was zeroed in by German observers. By May 1944, the beachhead was exhausted but ready to break free. The Operation Diadem was underway, with the goal of linking the Anzio forces to the Fifth Army advancing from the south. The Germans, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had turned the plains into a fortress. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and overlapping fields of fire defended every approach. For the men of the 34th Infantry Division, known as the Red Bull, this was another day in a campaign that had already cost them dearly. Their regiment, the 135th Infantry, was assigned to push through a maze of entrenched enemy positions north of the town of Cisterna di Latina. To reach it, they had to cross open farmland, flat, exposed, and dominated by German positions. Staff Sergeant George J. Hall led a rifle squad in Company B. They were ordered to advance under covering fire, to clear the way for the rest of the platoon. But as soon as they moved, German MG-42s opened up, those infamous weapons that spat 200 rounds a minute. The air became a storm of steel, and the men were pinned, unable to lift their heads from the dirt. Hall's eyes swept the field. No cover, no way forward. Yet somewhere out there, beyond that tangle of barbed wire and smoke, his men were bleeding out. The standard issue American Mk2 fragmentation grenade, nicknamed the Pineapple, was lethal but limited in range and fragmentation pattern. The Germans, by contrast, used the steel hand granite, the stick grenade, nicknamed the Potato Masher. It had a longer handle, better leverage for throwing, but its timed fuse made it unpredictable. American manuals warned against using captured ordnance. The fuse delay could vary wildly. Some grenades detonated early, some not at all. They were stamped in German, often booby-trapped or defective when scavenged from bodies. But Hall had already run through his own supply. Crawling through shell holes, he found what he needed: discarded German grenades, still intact. The choice was simple: disobey orders or die where he lay. That moment, when discipline yields to survival, defined the chaos of Anzio. The rules of war bent under the pressure of necessity, and individual soldiers began shaping the outcome with desperate, improvised courage. The ridge ahead still flashed with gunfire. The next few minutes would decide whether Hall's platoon lived or was erased by machine guns. The land around Cisterna di Latina was deceptive, open fields that promised visibility but offered no protection. Every furrow, every irrigation ditch was a potential death trap. The Germans had transformed the plain into a chessboard of fire zones, each machine gun nest covering the next. Their interlocking arcs meant that if one gun fell silent, another took over its field in an instant. The MG-42, the weapon that dominated those fields, was unlike anything most American infantrymen had ever faced. Its terrifying rate of fire, nearly 1/200 rounds per minute, created what soldiers called the buzz saw. The sound alone could freeze a man mid-step. From 600 meters, it could shred an entire squad in seconds. Against it, rifles and carbines felt almost useless. The U.S. infantry relied on small unit tactics, suppress and flank. But that required movement, something impossible under machine gun fire. In those moments, the grenade became the last weapon of initiative. A short, desperate arc of steel and TNT that could clear a nest faster than any rifle. The American Mk2 grenade, fragmentation type, had a blast radius of about 15 meters. Its fuse was reliable 4 to 5 seconds. The German steel hand granite 24, on the other hand, was a stick grenade designed for concussion, not fragmentation. It relied on shockwave, not shrapnel. Its fuse, pulled by a cord, burned unpredictably, sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes 8. It could be thrown farther thanks to its handle, but it demanded perfect timing and luck. Using one was considered dangerous, especially the captured ones, which might have faulty igniters or modified fuses. American field manuals clearly warned, "Do not employ enemy ordnance unless under dire necessity." For Hall, that necessity had arrived. He'd watched 2 of his men fall trying to advance. Every attempt to move drew another burst from the ridge. Their radio was dead. Artillery support was busy elsewhere. No one was coming. The battlefield around him was strewn with discarded gear, helmets, ammo boxes, broken rifles, and corpses. From a shallow shell crater, he spotted the familiar wooden handles of German grenades, still attached to the belts of dead soldiers. He crawled over, heart hammering, inspecting the fuses with the quick precision of a man who knew he might not get a second chance. He understood what he was doing. If one of those fuses burned short, he'd die instantly. If it burned long, he'd give away his position. But if it worked, if the timing was right, it could silence a machine gun and give his men a chance to live. As he loaded the captured grenades into his pockets, the sound of the MG-42s intensified. Dirt and stone erupted around him. The enemy had spotted movement. There was no time left. Hall pressed himself flat, felt the grain of the earth beneath his palms, and prepared to gamble his life against German engineering. In the chaos of Anzio, fear wasn't an abstract concept. It was tactile. It clung to the skin like sweat and dust. Every man on that field felt it, but not every man could act through it. For Staff Sergeant George Hall, leadership didn't come from orders. It came from example. His men were trapped, and he could feel their eyes on him even from behind the low dirt mounds. He was the one who had to move first. That was the unwritten law of the infantry NCO. If you froze, the squad froze. If you advanced, they believed they could survive. What Hall did that morning wasn't reckless courage. It was mathematical courage, the kind forged by repetition, experience, and necessity. He had been in Italy long enough to understand what the manual said and what the battlefield demanded. Fear was constant but useless. What mattered was discipline, breathing through the panic, counting the seconds, trusting the muscle memory. In that sense, the grenade became more than a weapon. It was an act of defiance against paralysis. Pulling the pin wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about proving control in a situation where no man had any. Every soldier in World War II knew that moment of choice. Stay still and die slowly, or move and risk everything. Hall chose movement. And that decision, simple as it seemed, marked the difference between chaos and command. The battlefield north of Cisterna was a tactician's nightmare. No cover, flat terrain, machine guns with perfect sight lines. Any conventional advance would have been suicide. Hall's crawl wasn't random, it was calculated. He moved during short lulls, reading the rhythm of the German bursts. The MG-42's sustained fire overheated barrels, forcing brief pauses every minute or so. Those few seconds were all he needed. He advanced in increments, 5 feet, 10 feet, using shallow shell holes as improvised cover. Each time he froze, counting, waiting for the enemy to resume. His goal was simple: get close enough for an accurate throw. When he finally reached the edge of effective range, the American pineapples were spent. That's when the captured steel Handgranaten became his lifeline. Their wooden handles allowed him to hurl them almost twice as far. He'd twist the cap, yank the pull cord, and throw with one motion, an art born from desperation. The first grenade landed directly beside the lead MG-42 nest. The explosion silenced it instantly. Hall waited for return fire, but the gun stayed quiet. He threw another at the second nest, a little farther up the slope. It detonated late, dangerously close to the next position. The third went off mid-air, its concussion stunning both sides into a momentary pause. Tactically, his attack achieved what artillery couldn't. It disrupted the synchronization of enemy fire. Once one position fell silent, the others lost coordination. His squad, seeing the opening, began to move again. The line was shifting. In the chaos of modern warfare, tactics are often written by survivors, not theorists. Hall's grenade duel at Anzio became a living demonstration of small unit improvisation, showing how one man's intuition could achieve what formal planning sometimes could not. The German steel hand granite 24 was both primitive and ingenious. A wooden handle screwed onto a cylindrical steel canister filled with 170 grams of TNT. Its design favored concussion over fragmentation. It killed by shock wave, not by shrapnel. The long handle gave greater throwing leverage, allowing soldiers to hurl it up to 40 meters, almost twice the distance of an American Mk2 grenade. But it was unpredictable. Its fuse was a simple friction igniter, lit by pulling a cord attached to a porcelain bead. The burn time, 4 to 7 seconds, was inconsistent, varying with moisture, age, and storage. American manuals warned that captured examples might have modified fuses or unstable TNT, especially those exposed to moisture or booby-trapped with shortened delays. In a modern sense, Hall was breaking more than a rule. He was gambling with physics. Every pull of that cord was a bet that the fuse would burn long enough to leave his hand. One misfire, and he would vanish in a flash of steel and dust. Ironically, the same features that made the steel hand granite forbidden also made it effective in Hall's situation. Its blast was better for clearing entrenched positions, bunkers, foxholes, and machine gun pits, where shockwave mattered more than fragments. By using the enemy's weapon against them, he turned their technological advantage into their undoing, and as those grenades thundered across the Anzio field, each one blurred the line between regulation and survival. By May 1944, the U.S. Army had begun to understand something hard to teach in any manual. Initiative wins battles. Doctrine taught soldiers to follow the chain of command. But the front at Anzio had shredded those lines. Radios failed, officers were hit, and NCOs, non-commissioned officers like Staff Sergeant Hall, became the pivot on which life or death turned. Hall wasn't a reckless man. His service record showed discipline, not impulse. But that morning, under fire, he embodied what American leadership training had started to call battlefield initiative. Suchen und Point Frauenleider, the ability to act decisively without waiting for permission. The manuals emphasized, if the situation demands immediate action, take it. The commander's intent remains the guiding principle. For Hall, that intent was survival and forward movement. He saw that traditional tactics, waiting for support or trying to flank, were impossible. The only way to lead was to break the rule that forbade using enemy ordnance. In that instant, Hall wasn't thinking of citations or commendations. He was thinking of the 11 men behind him, men who trusted him implicitly. Leadership in war is rarely about words. It's about motion. When he crawled forward, they followed his courage, not his voice. When he rose to throw, they learned that orders could bend. But responsibility never did. That quiet kind of leadership, initiative born of necessity, became the backbone of American infantry success throughout Italy. It turned chaos into cohesion. To the German gunners on that ridge, Hall was almost invisible. They saw only flashes of movement between the furrows, small, fleeting blurs that appeared and vanished as they fired. The MG-42's gunners, likely part of the 715th Infantry Division, were veterans of defensive warfare. They were trained to break attacks through volume, not precision. But grenades changed everything. Machine gunners were kings of open ground, but helpless in close quarters. The sound of a grenade hitting earth, its hollow thud, was enough to freeze any crew. They knew the fuse time. They'd felt it before. Every second between impact and detonation stretched into eternity. The first blast tore through their position, stunning the crew and filling the air with smoke and dust. The Germans shouted commands, but visibility was gone. One of them tried to pivot the gun, but the next grenade landed closer. The concussion slammed the walls of their pit, knocking them senseless. From their perspective, the attack was almost supernatural. A single American soldier advancing under impossible conditions, using their own weapons against them. Fear spread faster than gunfire. One nest after another fell silent, not because all were destroyed, but because men simply stopped shooting. They waited, listening for another throw that never came. In the fluid, savage arithmetic of battle, psychology mattered as much as firepower. Hall's defiance broke more than positions. It broke their nerve. In war, morality is often measured not in right and wrong, but in why. The U.S. Army's prohibition on using enemy grenades wasn't ethical. It was practical, meant to prevent accidental deaths. But for Hall, those regulations collided with the raw instinct to survive and protect his men. Was it forbidden? Yes. Was it necessary? Absolutely. The morality of combat shrinks to its smallest unit in moments like that. A single heartbeat. A single pull of a fuse. Hall's choice wasn't rebellion. It was adaptation. He didn't violate ethics. He redefined them for the battlefield. Later, when his Medal of Honor citation was written, it made no mention of forbidden grenades. It focused instead on extraordinary heroism. Because the truth of war is that heroism often hides inside disobedience, when the refusal to die quietly outweighs the comfort of following the rules. Hall's throw became symbolic, not of defiance, but of understanding that survival sometimes demands bending what was never meant to be absolute. The smoke over the Anzio plains had thickened into a low, gray ceiling. The sound of the MG-42s was unrelenting, a rhythmic howl echoing across the wheat fields. Each burst ripped the soil around Hall's position, sending shards of clay into his face. His men were still pinned 50 yards behind him, helpless to move. Hall pressed his body lower into the dirt, his left hand gripping the cool wooden handle of a captured steel hand granite. He'd already thrown 3, each closer, each riskier. Ahead, the German ridge still spat fire. He twisted the cap, felt the pull cord jerk free, and counted silently. 1, 2, 3. He threw. The grenade arced cleanly through the smoky air and vanished behind the lip of the machine gun pit. The explosion was instant, shorter than expected, sharper. Dirt and smoke shot skyward as the MG-42's chatter broke off mid-burst. A second later, screams carried faintly through the wind. Hall didn't wait. He crawled forward through the debris, using the brief silence to close the distance. His right knee burned. Shrapnel had grazed it, but adrenaline pushed the pain away. He reached the lip of the first nest. Inside, 2 German gunners lay motionless, their weapon twisted and blackened. He looked up. The next nest was only 30 yards ahead, half hidden by smoke. Hall could see flashes of muzzle fire through the haze. He ducked low, pulled another grenade from his belt, his last American pineapple, and tossed it sidearm. It bounced once, rolled into the pit, and detonated with a deafening crack. Still, the third machine gun kept firing. Hall could have stopped. He had done more than any single man could be asked to do. But something in him refused to leave it unfinished. Crawling again, each movement a battle against exhaustion, he found another body, another grenade. German, again. He twisted the cap, yanked the pull cord. The fuse burned unpredictably this time, sputtering. He threw, but the grenade landed short, exploding just in front of the enemy pit. The shockwave stunned him, filling his ears with ringing. Through the haze, he could see the Germans scrambling, momentarily disoriented. That was his opening. Hall rose to one knee and threw the last grenade with everything he had left. It disappeared into the smoke. A heartbeat later, a deep, muffled detonation rolled across the field. Silence followed. He waited. Nothing. No more bursts. No movement. Behind him, his men were watching through the smoke. Then slowly they began to rise. Hall waved his arm, signaling the advance. The platoon moved up, securing each position, finding the guns destroyed and their crews either dead or unconscious. The ridge, an obstacle that had halted their entire company, was finally theirs, but the cost was coming due. As Hall turned to report, a mortar shell exploded nearby. The blast threw him backward, shrapnel tearing through his leg. He fell hard, the world tilting sideways. His men rushed to him, voices muffled through the ringing in his ears. He tried to stand, but his leg was gone from the knee down. Even as they dragged him to cover, Hall refused to release his rifle. His hand clenched around the stock as if letting go meant undoing everything he'd just achieved. The ridge was silent now. No more gunfire, no more German shouts, only the crackle of burning ammunition. Hall's actions that morning allowed his company to break through the line and advance on Cisterna. But for him, the battle was over. He would never walk again. As the company surged past the shattered ridge, the tempo of the battle shifted. What had been a static stalemate became motion. The Germans, disoriented by the sudden collapse of their interlocking machine gun network, began to pull back toward secondary positions. For the first time in days, the 34th Infantry Division advanced without being cut to pieces. The field that had claimed so many men was now littered with wreckage, burned-out weapons, fragments of steel, and the wooden splinters of destroyed steel Handgranaten. The smell of TNT and scorched powder clung to the air. Hall's squad, still reeling from the blast that took their leader's leg, pressed forward under orders to secure the captured guns and clear the ridge. They found what remained of the German crews, some dead, others stunned and bleeding, still unable to comprehend how one wounded sergeant had undone them. Medics worked furiously over Hall in the shallow cover of a crater. They packed his wound, clamped what was left of the artery, and gave him morphine. Even then he was lucid, calm, almost detached. A fellow NCO later recalled that Hall kept asking whether the ridge had been taken. "Tell me we got it," he repeated, as if the loss of his leg meant nothing if the line had moved forward. Word of his actions spread through the battalion within hours. In a front where courage was routine, what Hall had done stood apart, not because he had charged alone, but because he had done it with thought, precision, and an impossible calm. Officers arriving to inspect the position found that his grenades had neutralized not one, but 3 entrenched machine gun posts, each with overlapping arcs. The official report called it a decisive act enabling the company to resume its advance. Hall was evacuated under heavy fire that afternoon. The medics carried him to a field station near Nettuno, where surgeons amputated his right leg above the knee. He never returned to combat. But the ridge he bought with blood and instinct stayed in American hands. Days later, the Anzio breakout accelerated. The 34th Division linked up with the 5th Army moving north from the Gustav Line. Rome would fall within 2 weeks. Strategically, the breach at Cisterna became one of the small hinges on which a massive campaign turned. A moment lost among grander maps, but remembered by every man who crawled through that field. For Hall, the battle never really ended. The pain was permanent. So was the memory of those seconds between pulling the cord and hearing the blast. But from the day he left Italy, the army made sure his story didn't fade into rumor. He received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation recorded his extraordinary heroism in action, the destruction of multiple enemy positions, and his refusal to quit despite catastrophic wounds. What it didn't mention, what only those who served beside him knew, was that his weapon of salvation had been a forbidden one. That detail, quietly omitted from the paperwork, lived on in whispered recollections of soldiers who had seen it happen. In the larger narrative of World War II, Hall's story became a parable of improvisation, how discipline and defiance could coexist, and how victory on a battlefield often depended not on overwhelming power, but on a single man's decision to ignore the book and trust his instincts. The ridge near Cisterna still bears the scars of that morning. Buried fragments of steel lie beneath the soil, remnants of grenades thrown by men who had no choice but to improvise under fire. From those splintered fragments, the next chapter of the war unfolded, the aftermath of courage, and the heavy cost that follows every act of defiance. When the smoke cleared over Cisterna, the battlefield fell eerily silent. The thunder of the MG-42s, which had pinned the 135th Infantry for hours, was gone. In its place, the distant rumble of tanks and the shouted orders of advancing infantry rolled across the Italian plain. For the 34th Infantry Division, the breakthrough that morning marked a critical turning point in the Anzio campaign. Hall's squad had neutralized a fortified position that had stalled the entire company. By destroying 3 machine gun nests single-handedly, he had opened a corridor through which the rest of the unit could advance. Within hours, American troops seized the ridge and began pushing north toward Cisterna di Latina, the gateway to Rome. Reports from the field described the ground as a mess of burned weapons, scattered grenades, and shattered helmets. The German defenders, elements of the 715th Infantry Division, had been caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the renewed assault. Dozens were killed, many others captured. Intelligence officers later noted that the loss of those key positions disrupted the entire local defense network, forcing the Germans to withdraw several kilometers by nightfall. Hall was evacuated from the front under fire. His right leg was gone, amputated above the knee in a field hospital near Nettuno. For days, he hovered between life and death. Yet, when visitors came to see him, he spoke not of pain, but of his men, asking who had made it through, who was still fighting. Word of his actions spread quickly through the division. Officers spoke of him in briefings. Chaplains mentioned him in sermons. By the time the Anzio breakout reached Rome 2 weeks later, Hall's name had already become legend among the infantrymen who'd survived those deadly plains. On February 10, 1945, the U.S. Army confirmed what his comrades already knew. Hall was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor. The official citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Staff Sergeant Hall, after his squad had been pinned down, crawled forward alone under heavy fire and destroyed 3 enemy machine gun positions, enabling his company to advance. The document made no mention of the captured German grenades. That detail remained unrecorded, known only to the men who'd watched him crawl through the smoke. But to them, that silence was fitting. The paperwork told the story of a hero. The truth told the story of a survivor. Hall's act wasn't just remembered, it became a lesson. His name was spoken in training camps as an example of what one man could do when initiative overcame fear. The ripples of that courage extended beyond Anzio, shaping how soldiers and leaders thought about battlefield improvisation in the years to come. For the soldiers who survived Anzio, the victory felt less like triumph and more like endurance. The beachhead that had once seemed doomed was now the springboard toward Rome. But the cost was staggering: over 7,000 Allied dead, with tens of thousands wounded. Every yard of soil had been paid for in blood. Yet amidst that grim arithmetic, the story of Staff Sergeant George J. Hall stood apart. His single act of courage had become part of a much larger shift in how modern armies viewed the role of the individual soldier. Military historians later called Anzio a laboratory of adaptation, a place where doctrine was rewritten by experience. Hall's decision to use captured German grenades, though officially forbidden, reflected the growing realization that flexibility and initiative mattered more than rigid obedience. In the months that followed, the Army quietly updated its field manuals. The revisions encouraged small unit leaders to exercise judgment in the use of available enemy materiel when circumstances demand. No citation linked that change directly to Hall, but among the veterans who had fought beside him, the connection was clear. His defiance had become precedent. Hall returned home to Stoneham, Massachusetts, in late 1944. He was greeted not with parades, but with quiet respect. The war had taken his leg, but not his spirit. Photographs from that time show him standing on crutches, his Medal of Honor gleaming against a simple uniform jacket. He rarely spoke of the battle itself. When pressed by reporters, he'd only say, "I just did what anyone else would have done." In truth, few could have done it. He spent his post-war years working with veterans, counseling those who carried invisible wounds. Fellow soldiers remembered his calm demeanor and his refusal to glorify what he'd done. "Hero," he would say softly, "is just another word for someone who didn't have a choice." Meanwhile, the site of his courage, those open fields north of Cisterna, remained scarred. Farmers plowing their land decades later still turned up fragments of grenades and twisted metal. The earth had swallowed the remnants of that morning, but not its memory. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the Anzio landings, surviving members of the 34th Infantry Division returned to Italy. Among them was George Hall, now gray-haired and steady on a prosthetic leg. As he stood on that same ridge, the wind rustling through the grass, he said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence carried everything. That ridge, once a killing ground, was now a place of peace. Yet the echoes remained, the sound of a single grenade, the impossible decision of one man, and the brief moment where defiance rewrote the fate of a battlefield. War is rarely remembered in seconds, but that's how it's lived. A pull of a cord, a heartbeat of silence, a single explosion that decides who goes home and who doesn't. Staff Sergeant George J. Hall's story is not just about a grenade. It's about the fragile boundary between order and chaos, between regulation and survival. In the sterile language of manuals, his actions were unauthorized. In the reality of Anzio, they were necessary. The battlefield does not honor rules. It honors outcomes. Hall's defiance was not rebellion. It was clarity under pressure. He understood, in that instant, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He acted not for glory, but because standing still meant death for his men. History often magnifies generals and strategies, but wars are truly won by those who crawl forward when logic says not to. Hall's grenade wasn't a miracle weapon. It was the embodiment of improvisation, of human will outlasting metal and doctrine. Long after the smoke cleared from Anzio, the world tried to define heroism in medals and citations. But true heroism resists definition. It's quieter. It's the trembling hand that still throws. The decision that defies the rulebook for the sake of a few lives more. Today, when historians speak of the forbidden grenade, they are not celebrating a weapon. They're honoring a moment when a 21-year-old sergeant chose instinct over instruction, and in doing so revealed the essence of combat: adaptation, courage, and sacrifice. The ridge he captured is peaceful now. Wheat grows again over the same soil that once swallowed steel and fire. Yet somewhere beneath it, fragments of those grenades still rest, mute witnesses to a truth older than any war. That survival, at its core, is an act of defiance. And so, the echo of that single throw lives on, not in glory, but in memory. Because history, when told honestly, is not about how many were killed per throw. It's about how far one act of impossible courage can reach through time.